Bianca hadn't changed her approach in 20 years. The easy-toned contempt folded inside something that almost sounded like affection. Gavin joined in without missing a beat, offering me employment at a property he had no idea was already spoken for. Neither of them noticed I'd barely looked at either of them since I walked in. My eyes had been fixed on the stage where the lights were already dimming. Something was coming. And when it arrived, how long would it take Bianca to understand the size of the mistake she'd just made? If you're new here, this channel is where real stories live. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. I drove to Riverton High in the same dark blue Chevy I'd kept since the early years of civic span, back when making payroll each month felt like defusing a bomb. My assistant had offered to arrange a car service. I told her not to bother. There was something I needed to feel on the drive over, something about arriving the same way I always had, without anyone opening a door for me. And I couldn't explain it in a way that would make sense to anyone who hadn't lived the version of this story that I had. The invitation had come 6 weeks earlier, printed on cardstock with the Riverton crest embossed in gold. 20-year reunion. Founders Hall. Dinner and remarks beginning at 7 in the evening. I'd folded it in half and set it on my desk, and for 2 weeks I left it there without touching it. It wasn't the reunion that made me hesitate. It was the second letter, the one from Monica Delaney, who sat on the school's board of trustees, who had quietly coordinated the trust paperwork on my behalf for the past 14 months. She wrote that the board wanted the announcement made in person. They wanted the students to know the man who had funded the renovation had once walked these same hallways with holes in his sneakers. I understood what she was asking, and I understood why. I just needed a little time before I said yes. My wife Danielle read both letters the evening I finally took them off my desk. She was in the kitchen, still in the blazer she'd worn to court, eating leftovers, standing up the way she always did when she got home too late to properly sit down. She read through Monica's letter twice, set it down, and said, "You should go." I told her I wasn't sure I wanted the attention. She looked at me with the particular patience she reserved for moments when she thought I was lying to myself, and said, "It's not about what you want. It's about what those kids need to see." She was right. She usually was. Danielle had her own conflict that evening, a budget hearing she'd been scheduled to testify at for months, tied to the state's funding formula for vocational programs. She said she'd drive straight from the Capitol building to Riverton the moment she was done, probably arriving late in the second hour. I told her not to rush. She gave me a look that meant she absolutely would, so I arrived alone. Charcoal suit, no tie, the mechanical watch I'd bought myself after we closed our first major port contract. No assistant, no security. I parked in the visitor lot and walked through the main entrance the same way I had every morning for 4 years as a student, except now the lobby had fresh paint and new lighting that the school couldn't actually afford to maintain, which was part of the reason I was there. Founders Hall had been restored beautifully. High ceilings, dark wood paneling the old stage at the front with new curtains in Riverton's colors. Round tables filled the floor, each one set with white linens and small centerpieces. The room was already half full when I arrived, a steady hum of voices and music underneath the sound of people reintroducing themselves to older versions of each other. I recognized some faces. Most of them didn't register mine. That was fine. That was the point. I got a glass of water from the bar and found a spot near the back where I could see the podium clearly. I wasn't there to catch up. I was there to do one thing, and once it was done, Danielle and I had plans to get dinner somewhere quiet where nobody knew either of our names. I was still on my first glass of water when I heard her laugh. Even across a crowded room, Bianca's laugh had a way of cutting through everything else. It was designed to big and musical, calibrated to pull focus. I looked up and saw her near the center of the room, her hand on the arm of a man I didn't know, wearing a dress that had cost more than my first car. She was holding court the way she always had, surrounded by people who were leaning in, laughing along, competing for proximity. 20 years had changed her hair and sharpened her style, but the performance was identical. The man beside her was doing most of the talking at that moment. He was broad-shouldered, tan in the way of someone who spent time on boats rather than outdoors, and he had the easy confidence of a person who had never seriously doubted himself. I'd learn his name shortly. Gavin Rourke, commercial real estate, the kind of loud money that announces itself before it walks into the room. He was saying something about a development deal, gesturing with his drink, and the people around him were nodding in that particular way that meant they were more impressed by his certainty than by any specific thing he was saying. Bianca spotted me about 20 minutes after I arrived. I saw the moment of recognition cross her face, a brief recalibration, then a slow smile that I knew well. She said something to Gavin, touched his arm, and started walking in my direction with the unhurried confidence of someone who had already written the ending to whatever was about to happen. "Julian Carver," she said. Not a question. More like she was confirming a suspicion. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Monica sent a personal invitation," I said. "Seemed rude to skip it." Bianca looked me over the way she used to in the years we were married, starting at my shoes, working upward, cataloging everything, arriving at a conclusion before I'd said 2 sentences. "Still in the same line of work?" she asked. Her tone made the question sound innocent enough, but I knew the map beneath it. I told her I was still in infrastructure and logistics. That was accurate. It covered about 1% of the actual answer, but it was accurate. Something shifted in her expression. A small satisfaction, like she'd confirmed something she'd suspected. "So still in the warehouses," she said, turning slightly toward the group that had migrated closer. "I always thought eventually you'd find something with a little more upward mobility." There was a ripple of laughter from the people nearby. Gavin arrived at her shoulder at that moment, and she made a brief introduction. "Julian, an old friend from school, works in maintenance," and the word landed the way she intended it to. Gavin extended his hand and shook mine with the particular firmness of a man who uses handshakes to measure people. He said it was good to meet me, then immediately pivoted back to the story he'd been telling, something about acquiring the parcel of land behind the school and what he planned to build there. His voice had the practiced ease of a pitch, and I noticed he didn't break eye contact with the group when he spoke, even though he'd just met me. Some people sell themselves to whoever's in front of them. Gavin sold himself to the room. I listened to him talk for about 90 seconds. Bianca watched my face while he spoke. I think she expected something, discomfort or envy, or the look I apparently used to get when she described how well things were going for other people. I kept my expression even. That seemed to bother her more than the alternatives. "Are you here alone?" she asked when Gavin's attention had drifted back to his audience. "My wife's coming later," I said. "She had a hearing that ran long." Bianca's eyebrows rose just slightly. It was the kind of expression that performs skepticism without fully committing to it. "Of course," she said, and then quieter, turning back toward me. "You always did have a plan for everything, Julian, even when the plan didn't quite work out." She smiled when she said it, like we were reminiscing, like it was a shared memory we both found charming now. I looked at her for a moment. There was a version of this conversation where I said exactly what I was thinking, where I laid out the full picture with the same calm I'd used in 100 boardrooms and let the arithmetic speak for itself. The number of zeros in CivicSpan's last valuation. The name of the firm that had quietly purchased the property Gavin was describing as his next deal. The $48 million sitting in a restricted educational trust 3 floors beneath the building where we were standing. But I'd learned something about timing over the years. Every piece of information has a best moment, and this wasn't it. "I don't think a reunion is the right place to settle old scores," I said. My voice stayed level. "It'd be a waste of a good evening." Bianca tilted her head like she was considering that, then smiled again. "Nobody's settling scores, Julian. I'm just catching up." She turned toward a woman nearby and started a new thread of conversation, smooth as a gear shift, and I was peripheral again within seconds. I went back to my spot near the wall. I set my empty glass down on a nearby table and didn't replace it. Gavin found me again about 15 minutes later without Bianca. He'd done some reading on his phone, I could tell by the way he looked at me, something recalculating behind his eyes. He made a comment about the work I did. More careful this time, less dismissive. He mentioned that some of his properties needed systems upgrades, and that if I ever wanted to pass along a card, he was always open to bringing on quality vendors. He said the word vendors with the particular lightness of someone who thinks they're being generous. I told him I appreciated it and didn't offer a card. He watched me for a second longer than was comfortable, then excused himself. I watched him walk back toward Bianca, lean in close, say something I couldn't hear. Bianca glanced back at me once quick, unreadable, then returned to her conversation. I didn't know exactly what Gavin had found on his phone. I didn't know how much he'd pieced together. But I knew a man doing quiet damage control when I saw one, and I filed it away. Across the room, the hall staff had started dimming the perimeter lights. The stage at the front brightened. Someone at the podium tapped the microphone once, and the conversations around the room began to soften and settle. Monica Delaney was standing in the wings of the stage holding a folder, wearing the calm expression of someone who had been preparing for this moment for a long time and was ready. I thought about Danielle, probably in her car by now, moving through traffic toward this building. I thought about the afternoon 12 years ago when I'd signed the paperwork for CivicSpan's first real office, a 2-room suite above a shipping broker in South Philadelphia, and I'd sat alone at the desk for about 10 minutes just listening to how quiet it was. No one to tell, no one who would have understood. I'd called my mother, who cried, and then I'd ordered a sandwich and gone back to work. I thought about the night Bianca left the 6th loan rejection in my coat pocket, her suitcase already by the door, the way she'd said the word failure without any particular anger, just as a statement of fact, the way you'd describe weather. I'd thought about that word for a long time afterward. I'd built a lot of things trying to argue back against it. At some point, I'd stopped arguing. I'd just kept building. Now I stood in the back of Founders Hall in a suit that cost more than 3 months of my old salary, watching the lights settle on the stage, watching Monica step to the microphone, watching Bianca across the room lean toward someone and whisper something and smile. She still had no idea. Not one person in this room did. The microphone crackled once as Monica adjusted it. She looked out at the audience, gathered herself, and began to speak. Monica Delaney had a particular quality I'd noticed the first time we met in person about 14 months before that evening, the ability to hold a room without raising her voice. She'd been that way in school too, the kind of person who spoke carefully and meant every word, which was part of why I'd trusted her with the coordination of something I'd spent years keeping quiet. She set her folder on the podium and looked out at the room for a moment before she began. The conversations had mostly settled by then, though a few people near the back were still finishing sentences. Monica waited without any visible impatience, and eventually the room came to her. She started with the school. Not with numbers, not with the funding gap. She started with a classroom on the 3rd floor where the roof had been leaking for 2 years, where a teacher had been placing buckets along the back wall during rainstorms and continuing her lesson, like nothing was happening because the alternative was canceling class entirely. She talked about the vocational wing, which had been partially closed for 18 months after the hydraulic lifts in the auto mechanics bay were condemned. She talked about the library, where an entire section of shelving had to be dismantled after water damage warped the floor beneath it. These weren't statistics. They were specific, and they landed that way. Then she explained what had changed. A former student, she said, had contacted the board through a private foundation. That student had proposed a full restoration of the campus, not a renovation, a restoration along with the construction of a new technical training facility on a piece of adjacent property that had sat vacant for years. The total commitment was $48 million, structured through an educational trust that gave the school permanent use of both the land and the facilities, with no commercial interest retained by the donor. I heard Bianca's voice somewhere to my left, speaking low to someone. "Has to be a developer," she said. "They always attach conditions." She wasn't wrong as a general rule. She just had the specific case wrong. Monica moved to the screen behind her where the architectural renderings came up one at a time. The library with its new reading rooms and digital archive. The restored Founders Hall. The vocational labs with equipment that actually worked. And the centerpiece, a 2-floor technical training center with robotics stations, an automation lab, and fabrication tools. The room responded with genuine sound, not polite applause, but the involuntary kind, the kind that escapes before people decide to make it. Then Monica looked back out at the audience and said the name. The donor is the founder and chairman of CivicSpan Industries, a logistics infrastructure company, currently valued at $7.2 billion. His name is Julian Carver. The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something doesn't immediately compute. I heard someone near the stage say the name back almost to themselves like they were testing how it sounded. Then the light shifted. One of the hall staff had redirected a spotlight, and it settled directly on the area where I was standing. I didn't move. I let the moment sit. Across the room, I watched it happen in sequence. The people nearest to me turned first, then the ripple spread outward. A woman I'd sat behind in junior year chemistry covered her mouth with her hand. Two men near the bar looked at each other with the open uncertainty of people who aren't sure if they've missed something obvious or if something genuinely unprecedented just occurred. Gavin went completely still, his drink halfway to his mouth, his eyes on me with an expression I recognized. It was the look of someone recalculating risk in real time. And Bianca. Bianca's wine glass slipped. She caught it barely, but not before a little went over the rim and onto the tablecloth. She looked down at the glass in her hand as if she wasn't sure how she was holding it, then looked up at me, and I watched the full architecture of the evening restructure itself behind her eyes. I straightened my jacket and walked toward the stage. Monica met me at the steps and extended her hand. I shook it and she leaned in briefly and said, "Thank you for being here." I told her thank you for doing this right. Then I turned and faced the room. I hadn't prepared remarks. I'd thought about it and decided against it because anything I wrote in advance would have the wrong shape, too formal, too finished. So I said what was actually true. I said that Riverton was the first place that gave me access to a real set of tools, and that the years I'd spent learning how machines worked had taught me more about building something from scratch than anything I'd learned afterward. I said that no school with a vocational program worth anything should have to close those rooms because there wasn't enough money to fix a lift. And I said that the students coming up behind us deserved to inherit something better than a leaking roof and empty shelving. That was all. I thanked Monica and the board and I stepped back. The applause started somewhere in the middle of the room and spread. I walked back down the steps and found a place to stand near the edge of the stage away from the main tables where I had a clear line to the entrance. Danielle came through the main doors about 4 minutes later. I saw her before she saw me, still in her court clothes, her bag over one shoulder, scanning the room with the focused look of someone who has been driving fast and is now recalibrating to the pace of the room they've just entered. Her eyes found me, and she crossed the floor directly, no detours. She took my hand when she reached me, and Monica, who had come down from the stage by then, introduced herself and welcomed Danielle as director of Second Bell Foundation. They spoke for a moment about the trust structure and the board's timeline for breaking ground. Beside the city board representative who had arrived earlier for the signing ceremony stood a man I recognized from the pre-event paperwork, a financial compliance officer the board had brought in as standard procedure for a grant commitment of this size. He was quiet, stationed near the wall, doing what compliance officers do at events like this, watching, noting, saying very little. I watched Bianca across the room during that conversation. She was standing with a small group, but she wasn't talking. She was watching me and Danielle, and something in her posture had changed. The performance had come down. She looked like a person doing private arithmetic and not liking where it was landing. She came over about 15 minutes later after the formal program had wrapped and the room had loosened back into conversation. Gavin was no longer beside her. She approached alone, and she was slower about it than she'd been earlier in the evening, more deliberate. "Julian," she said. Her voice had changed register, quieter, no audience. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. She said that she'd always believed I had something in me, that she'd just, and here she searched for the right phrasing, that she'd struggled back then with uncertainty. She said that maybe the pressure she'd put on me had pushed me forward in ways she hadn't intended. She was rewriting it as she went. I could hear the construction happening in real time, building a version of events where her leaving was something I needed. She mentioned almost as an aside that her event planning firm worked regularly with nonprofits, and that Second Bell Foundation's work was exactly the kind of mission she liked to align with. Danielle, who had been standing at my side through all of this, said nothing until Bianca finished. Then she asked very simply, "If Julian were still a maintenance technician, if none of this had changed, would you be apologizing to him tonight?" The question landed without any special emphasis. Danielle said it the way she said everything, directly and without performance. Bianca opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked down at her glass. The answer lived in that silence, and everyone near enough to hear the question understood it. Bianca turned away first. Danielle didn't add anything. That was the end of it, or it should have been. Gavin moved when I wasn't watching him. I noticed the shift in the room before I saw him directly, a change in the quality of the noise, a few heads turning toward the front of the hall. By the time I looked, he was already standing near the podium that Monica had used, speaking loudly enough to be heard across several tables, holding his phone up with something on the screen. He said that before everyone accepted the evening's narrative at face value, there were some questions worth asking. He said he'd been doing some research and had found documentation suggesting that CivicSpan stood to gain commercial operating rights over portions of the property once the renovation was complete. He said the word transparency several times. He said that a $48 million gift from a private corporation to a public school deserved scrutiny, not applause. High had a document. He put it on the hall's secondary display screen, the one used for announcements. It looked official. It had a header, a seal, a signature at the bottom. A few people in the room began reading it. I heard the conversations shift, the particular uncertainty of an audience that has been applauding and now isn't sure if it should have. Someone near the entrance had a phone out and was filming. The school's live stream, which had been running for alumni watching remotely, was still active. My legal team called while Gavin was still speaking. I felt the vibration in my jacket pocket, looked at the screen, and let it go to voicemail. They called again 30 seconds later. I stepped away from Danielle and answered. The call was brief. My general counsel told me that a contractor we'd been negotiating a major port infrastructure deal with had seen the stream and was asking questions. She said the words conflict of interest and said they needed resolution quickly. I told her I was aware and that I would call her back within the hour. Danielle was at my shoulder when I turned around. She looked at the screen, then at Gavin, then at me. She said quietly, "Is it real?" The document, no, I said. Can you prove that tonight? Yes, I said. Bianca had moved to Gavin's side by then. I watched it happen. She crossed the room and stood next to him, and he handed her something, a sheet of paper, and spoke close to her ear. She read it. Whatever he was asking her to do with it, she stood there holding it, which was its own kind of answer. Then she looked at me. Not with cruelty this time, more with the look of a person who has picked a direction and isn't confident in it, but has already started moving. She stepped forward and told the room that Julian had always been private about money during their marriage, that she'd had no real visibility into his financial decisions, and that if there were questions about the nature of this donation, she thought those questions were reasonable. She didn't call me a liar. She just declined to vouch for me, which in the moment functioned the same way. The city board representative signaled to Monica that the paperwork should be held pending clarification. Monica looked at me. I nodded once, telling her to hold. The stream was still running. Someone had already clipped the footage and posted it. I could see people in the room looking at their phones, reading, sharing. The header on Gavin's document was visible on the secondary screen at the front, official-looking, convincing at a glance, the kind of thing designed to be screenshotted before anyone reads it carefully. I looked at Gavin, who had moved back from the podium and was now standing with his arms folded, watching the room respond to what he'd set in motion. He had the expression of a man who has played a card and is waiting to see if it holds. I thought about the audit report sitting in my phone's secure folder, every page of it, and about exactly how many names appeared in those pages alongside Gavin's, including Bianca's. I thought about what it would feel like to send that file to Monica right now, to have it on the main screen in 60 seconds, to let this room see the full picture of what Gavin had built and how he'd built it and whose signature he'd used. I had every right. I had every fact. I had the cleaner argument and the cleaner record, and I could end this in under 5 minutes. I put my phone back in my pocket. Then I walked toward the stage. I asked for 10 minutes. Monica was at the edge of the stage when I reached her, and I said it quietly, so only she could hear. She looked at the room, then back at me, and nodded. She went to the podium first and asked for everyone's attention, explaining that Julian Carver had requested a brief opportunity to address the concerns that had just been raised. The room resettled. Gavin stayed where he was, arms still folded. Bianca was a few feet to his left, still holding the paper he'd handed her. I didn't take the podium. I stood beside it, which felt right, less formal, more direct. I told the room that I understood the concern and that if I were sitting in the audience right now, I'd want the same thing, a clear answer, not a defense. Then I asked Monica to open the Trust's document archive on the main screen. Not the secondary display where Gavin's file was still visible, the main screen connected to the Foundation's independent storage system, time-stamped and third-party verified. Monica pulled it up. The full agreement appeared every page, every clause, every signature with its corresponding date. I walked through it without rushing. CivicSpan held no commercial operating rights over any portion of the Riverton property. The company had no ownership stake in the land, no revenue interest in the facilities, and no role in selecting contractors for the construction phase. I had personally signed a restriction barring CivicSpan from bidding on any building contracts connected to the project, specifically to prevent the appearance of a conflict. The property acquired adjacent to the school had been transferred directly into a permanent educational trust, not to the Foundation, not to CivicSpan, not to me personally. The trust's beneficiary was the school district in perpetuity. The room read along. I could see it happening, people moving through the pages on their phones as Monica scrolled, cross-referencing, doing the thing that any reasonable person should do when confronted with two competing sets of documents. Then Monica moved to the second part. She didn't announce it dramatically. She simply opened the metadata file for the documents Gavin had displayed and let the information speak. Every file in his packet had been created within the past 3 weeks. The seal on the header was from a version of the school district's official template that had been retired over a year ago. The signature at the bottom belonged to a board member who had stepped down 14 months earlier and had not signed any document related to CivicSpan or the Riverton project at any point. Monica moved through each detail at an even pace, one point, then the next, then the next. The room absorbed it the same way, quietly, without theatrics. There was no dramatic reveal, just a steady accumulation of facts that made the conclusion unavoidable. When she finished, the compliance officer, who had been stationed near the wall, stepped forward. He approached Gavin directly and spoke to him in a low voice. Gavin looked at him, then at the room, then at Bianca. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. He started toward the far exit with the controlled speed of someone who wants to leave without appearing to run, and he made it about halfway across the floor before the compliance officer quietly asked him to stay. The two of them moved to a side corridor together, and that was the last the room saw of Gavin that evening. Bianca was still standing in the same spot. She was holding the paper Gavin had given her, and she looked at it like she was seeing it differently now, not reading it but recognizing it for what it was. Something she'd been handed and asked to vouch for without fully understanding what she was holding. The people nearest to her had taken a step back, that instinctive social distance that opens up around a person when a room is deciding what to make of them. I stepped down from the stage and walked toward her. Not quickly, not with any particular intention on my face. I stopped a few feet away and waited until she looked up. "Bianca," I said, "whatever Gavin told you about that document, you still have a choice about what to do with it." She looked at me for a long moment. I think she was trying to determine if there was something behind the offer, a trap, a performance, some version of what she would have done in the same position. But there wasn't anything behind it. I was tired of the evening's theatrics, and I was giving her the shortest available path to the truth. She set the paper down on the table beside her. Then she turned to face the room and said that the document Gavin had asked her to confirm was not something she could verify because she had not seen it before tonight. She said that Gavin had used her company's name in investment filings. She had not fully reviewed, that she had been aware something was irregular for some time, and that she had not acted on it the way she should have. Then she said something I hadn't asked her to say and hadn't expected. She said that Julian Carver had been honest with her throughout their marriage, that the debts he'd carried going into those years had been partly hers, and that the work he'd done while she'd dismissed it had been the foundation of everything he'd built since. She said she had told him his plans were a waste of time. She said she had been wrong about that and wrong about him. The room was very quiet while she spoke. She didn't cry. Her voice didn't break. She just said it evenly and completely, and when she was finished, she sat down. I didn't respond to it publicly. There wasn't anything useful I could have added, and she hadn't said it to receive anything from me. I turned back to Monica, who was already in conversation with the city board representative. After a few minutes of review, the representative confirmed that the trust documentation was sound and that the signing could proceed. The ceremony was brief. Monica and the superintendent signed the agreements at the table by the stage while the room watched. When it was done, the superintendent shook my hand and said they would break ground by early spring. Monica leaned in and said, "Thank you for staying calm tonight." I told her I'd had a good teacher in that regard, and I looked over at Danielle, who was talking to one of the school board members with the efficient warmth she brought to every professional conversation. She caught my eye across the room and gave me a small nod. Afterward, the principal pulled me aside to discuss the naming of the technical center. He said the board had agreed unanimously to call it the Carver Innovation Center, and he said it with the tone of someone delivering very good news. I thanked him and told him I needed it to be something else. He looked uncertain, so I explained. I told him the point of the space was not to mark where I'd ended up, but to be accessible to whoever was starting out. A name like mine on the door sent the wrong message. It said the room belonged to someone who had already made it rather than to everyone who hadn't yet. I asked him to call it the Open Workshop. He wrote it down. He said he thought he understood, and I believed him. Monica made the announcement to the room a few minutes later. The name and the first programs that would run out of the space beginning the following fall: vocational scholarships for current students, retraining courses for adults who had been displaced from jobs in the area, and a dedicated track for single parents looking to shift into technical fields. There was real applause for that last one. Not the polite kind. Most of the room had thinned out by the time I made my way to the east corridor, the one that ran along the original part of the building past the rows of framed class photos going back 40 years. I'd been walking through it slowly while Danielle finished a conversation near the entrance, looking at the photographs, the way you do when you're in no particular hurry, and a place holds more history than you usually let yourself sit with. I heard footsteps slow behind me, and when I turned, Bianca was there. She hadn't left the building after all. I'd seen her moving toward the main doors earlier, but she'd stopped somewhere along the way and found this corridor instead. We stood there for a moment, both looking at the wall at a photograph from our graduating year. We were in it somewhere, both of us young in the way that looks almost fictional from 20 years out. "Did you build all of this to prove I was wrong?" she asked. Her voice was quiet and plain, without accusation. I looked at the photograph for another moment before I answered. In the beginning, I said yes, some of it. I told her that for a long time every contract felt like an argument I was winning with someone who wasn't in the room. Every number on a balance sheet felt like a reply to a conversation she'd ended years ago. I didn't say it to wound her. I said it because it was true, and I'd gotten old enough to say true things without needing them to do damage. At some point, I said, I realize that building something just to make another person regret leaving is still a way of letting them run your life. The only real difference between that and failure is the tax bracket. Bianca looked at the photograph on the wall. "Do you think it could have been different?" she asked. "If I'd believed in you back then." I thought about it genuinely, the way the question deserved. "Maybe," I said. "Nothing more than that. No explanation, no comfort, no verdict. Just the honest answer to an honest question." She nodded once slowly. Then she said goodnight and walked toward the exit. I stayed in the corridor a little longer, listening to her footsteps fade and then to the quiet of the old building settling around me. Danielle found me there a few minutes later. She slipped her hand into mine without saying anything, and we walked together toward the main entrance and out through the front doors into the cool evening. We came around the side of the building toward the parking lot, passing the fence that bordered the adjacent property, the old manufacturing site that would become the technical center. The construction lights were already up on the perimeter, and through the chain-link fence you could see the site maps posted on a board just inside the gate, large printed renderings of what the space would look like when it was finished. There were 4 kids standing at the fence, maybe 15 or 16 years old, looking through the chain link at the renderings in the construction light. One of them was pointing at something and explaining it to the others. Another one was pressed close to the fence reading the text on the plans. A third one turned when he heard our footsteps and looked at me with the open, assessing gaze of a teenager deciding whether an adult is worth talking to. He asked if I knew what they were building there. I told him I had some idea. He said he'd heard it was going to have a robotics lab and that he'd been trying to teach himself automation design from videos online, but that he didn't have a computer at home that could run the software. He said it without self-pity, just as a fact, the way kids sometimes state the specific obstacles in front of them before they've learned to soften them for adult audiences. I unlatched the gate and told them to come take a look at the site plans up close, the full ones, not just what was visible from the fence. The four of them moved through the gate and gathered around the board, and I stood with them and started explaining how the automation lab was designed, how the fabrication floor would connect to the training stations, why the layout was built the way it was. They asked real questions, the kind that take time to answer properly. Danielle stood a little to the side watching. I could feel her watching without looking back at her. I knew what her expression would be. I'd seen it before in moments like this one. Not pride exactly, more like recognition. I wasn't the man who had been mocked at the reunion. I wasn't the billionaire who had written the check. I was a person who had learned how things worked by taking them apart, standing at an open gate with four kids who wanted to learn the same thing. Bianca once told me that effort couldn't substitute for results. For a long time, I believed she was talking about money. It took me years to understand she was wrong about the results too, that the real measure was never the balance sheet or the title or the moment someone who doubted you finally sees the number. The real measure was simpler than all of that. It was whether the life you built had room in it for other people to start building theirs. These four kids at the fence, this was the result. This was what all of it had been for. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already subscribed, there are more stories like this one waiting for you here.